Welcome to episode 22 of the Jedi Temple Archives podcast.
There is more knowledge here than anywhere else in the galaxy. Only members of the Jedi Council are allowed access. Guarding the holocrons is one of the most important duties a Jedi can be given. Do you think you're up to the task?
Star Wars fans, welcome to another episode of the Jedi Temple Archives podcast. We're recording this episode on Tuesday, August 13th, 2019. And today's episode, we are going to cover or start covering some of the information on the bounty hunters that we see in Empire Strikes Back. Primarily because it's going to tie in nicely when The Mandalorian comes out on Disney Plus streaming service this fall. And to help me discuss this, I have back my trusty co-pilot and co-host, Tom. Tom, welcome back to the show.
Well, hello, Rob. Always good to be with you on the Jedi Temple Archives podcast.
Yeah, we tell ourselves that every week, and I'm still hoping that it's true. Right on. So I think we'll go ahead. We'll just jump right into this week's topic. And really the reason that I want to do this again was because once The Mandalorian comes out this fall, we're going to be dealing with bounty hunters for sure. I know that there is a character that's going to be part of that Mandalorian series who a lot of people think is IG-88, which is the robot bounty hunter from Empire Strikes Back when Vader brings them all to his ship to help track down Han Solo and Princess Leia. So it looks familiar, but my understanding of that is it's actually going to be a different character named IG-11. That being said, I think there's still going to be a lot of crossover between those two characters. And also this week, we're going to go ahead and dive into a little bit on Boba Fett, who is a better known character for most of the fans of the films. But there's still a lot of information that gets revealed about Boba Fett through the Clone Wars. And for the casual Star Wars fan who may not know all that backstory, we'll fill some of that in. And he kind of has an interesting relationship with IG-88 as well. So they seem like the perfect combination to discuss together. And then we'll do another episode down the road to discuss those other bounty hunters, the other four that are there aboard Darth Vader's flagship in Empire Strikes Back are Dengar, who is a human male. He's kind of got the wrappings around his head. And then you've also got Bosk, who's the Trandoshan bounty hunter. And then there's also 4LOM and Zuckuss, who are the other two. So we'll get into those guys in another episode. But for this, I think we're going to just start off with that clip from Empire Strikes Back.
Bounty hunters. We don't need that scum.
Yes, sir.
Those rebels won't escape us.
Sir, we have a priority signal from the Star Destroyer Avenger.
Right.
There will be a substantial reward for the one who finds the Millennium Falcon. You are free to use any methods necessary, but I want them alive. No disintegration.
As you wish. Lord Vader. My lord, we have them.
So really that is one of the most iconic scenes within Empire Strikes Back in regards to seeing some great characters that we really don't learn much about. But I think probably the best place to start off here would be IG-88. There's a little less information known about him within canon, at least.
Yeah, you really know very little about him in canon. You pretty much just see him, at least on the films, within the one scene there on the ship with Vader, kind of rallying the bounty hunter troops to find Han Solo and Princess Leia, and then you really don't see him again in any of the other films. We do discover him in other ways throughout canon, but there is really very little known about him. You just know he's just kind of this cool bounty hunting droid.
Right. And to give a little backstory on IG-88, at least within canon, and again, I say that because he was a lot better developed within the old legend stories. There were actually some backstories on all those bounty hunters. Unfortunately, those are just exactly what I said. They're legends at this point. So we will see how much of that information gets brought back into canon. But for now, what we do know about IG-88 is that he is part of the IG series of assassin droid models, and those were created by a company known as Holowan Laboratories. I wonder if there's any tie in there to Obi-Wan.
No.
I'm just kidding. Right. So Tom's like, absolutely not. He was also known by his designation of IG-88B. And again, that ties back into some of the Legends backstories. There was IG-88A and B, and IG-88B is the one of the two of them that actually had survived kind of their early missions. And they were also known as Foot droids. So kind of an odd name there. But he basically understood that he had a desire to kill right from the moment he was first activated. He basically kind of went rogue from the laboratory where he was created and pretty quickly became one of the most feared bounty hunters in the galaxy. And the interesting tie-in between he and Boba Fett is that Boba Fett had a innate fear of droids. It was one of the very few things that he was really afraid of, and it was primarily the assassin droids that he experienced within the Clone Wars. So he established himself pretty early on as a rival to Boba Fett within the Star Wars universe.
Yeah, they had a pretty fierce rivalry, as a matter of fact. For all bounty hunters, they're all looking to capture a lot of times the same client person, whoever is out there running free, and that someone wants to kind of bring them in and get that bounty, get that money, get those credits. And a lot of times these two would end up running into each other in various different locations, going head to head. And some things that you might be surprised to hear. As a matter of fact, I'm sure you'll go over this as you go through a little bit more about IG-88 and Boba Fett.
Right. Yeah. And so as far as IG-88's career goes, there's some really cool tie-ins both to Star Wars Rebels and Solo, a Star Wars story, or at least characters from those films. One of the very early jobs that IG-88 was given through the Empire, he was hired by Agent Kallus, who's kind of a main player on the Imperial side initially within Star Wars Rebels. And he was hired by Agent Kallus to track down an Imperial Army deserter who you may have heard of before, and that would be Captain Han Solo.
Be interested to get into some of those comics. I've been wanting to read them. I've been trying to get into them, and I look forward to purchasing them soon and digging into them, because I find there's so much more depth that's being explored now within the comics, within some of the books, all the literature that's coming out now. You're really finding a lot more interesting stuff and some backstories on some characters that maybe you knew very little about, or at least maybe they're expanding more on what was originally the expanded universe, now is Legends.
Yeah, and so another tie-in with IG-88 too, as I mentioned, one of the characters that we learned about within Star Wars, sorry, I keep doing this, Solo, a Star Wars story, is he had a mission that he went on to track down Kira and basically bring her in to capture her bounty, and he teamed up for that mission with Hondo Ohnaka, who is another character that we have talked about on this podcast, and who is another one of those characters that you run across within both the Clone Wars as well as Star Wars Rebels. And I do actually have a clip of that. The Star Wars Forces of Destiny clips are just kind of short cartoon clips, and they're all around 2.5 minutes long. So I'm going to go ahead and play that for you now.
Forces of Destiny.
Stop and surrender.
Kira. It does look like you have fallen into our little trap. Catching you was quite difficult, my young friend. I had to partner with IG-88 here.
A Crimson Dawn lieutenant will fetch a nice bounty.
You're splitting bounty credits? That's not like you, Hondo. And I thought you hated droids.
Well, true, but
Why are you bothering with me anyway? That droid is worth more than I am.
Well, actually, The bounty on me is more than you two put together.
Really?
Did you see that? That droid was obviously going to double-cross me. Ah.
Good idea.
What? What? What?
You were right. That droid was useful. As a distraction.
How did you... Where were... What is going on?
You're about to make me rich.
I am... But that is robbery, extortion. It's a crime. You never would have caught me if I had not caught you first.
You double-crossed me?
Well, but she triple-crossed you. That is much worse.
Ugh. Start walking.
All right. Tell you what. I will split the bounty with you 70-30. Fine 80-20.
We are in no position to negotiate.
Quiet, you. You see, this is why I don't like droids. We are in no position. Always interrupting. Now, what was I saying?
Again, we know from Solo: A Star Wars Story that Kira is pretty good at taking care of herself, and certainly is a clever woman, and she certainly proves that within that clip.
All the more reason we need to hashtag make Solo 2 happen. We need to hear more of Kira, because I really think that she could be a very much more well-developed and interesting character. I know that there's got to be a lot there. I would love to find out more about her, but if we don't get an actual Solo 2, then maybe at least they can expand more on her story within the comics, within the books, whatever the case may be.
Right. So there are a couple of other minor missions that IG-88 partakes in, but really the next major event within the Star Wars universe that you see IG-88 take a part in is, again, like we said, he was hired by the Dark Lord of the Sith, Darth Vader, and brought aboard his flagship to help track down Princess Leia and Han Solo and the Millennium Falcon, along with those other bounty hunters that we mentioned. And in the process of that, he really wasn't sure how to go about tracking down Han and Leia, but he certainly knew that Boba Fett was clever enough to come up with a good plan to track them down. And while we did see within The Empire Strikes Back that, as Han Solo and Princess Leia detach from the back of the Star Destroyer and quote unquote float away with the rest of the garbage and then head off to Bespin, we see Boba Fett kind of drop in behind them and start tracking them. And what is not shown on screen is that IG-88 is essentially tracking Boba Fett, planning to steal the bounty from him once they get wherever they may be going.
Yeah, and they end up squaring off in Bespin before they actually capture Han and Leia and kind of duke it out. And once again, Boba kind of came out on top.
Yeah, he basically ends up leaving IG-88 for scrap metal after that confrontation. Again, it's another thing that we certainly don't see within the film, but that whole story of what went on Bespin, I know kind of one of the interesting things about the whole series of events that takes place on Bespin is there's a lot of thought within the Star Wars universe or within the Star Wars community kind of about how long they must have been on Bespin, because it's intercut with all the scenes of Luke training on Dagobah, and you have to assume that Luke's training on Dagobah lasted for some significant period of time, whether that was, days or weeks or whatever the case may be. So it's never really clear from the series of events on Bespin just how long they're there, but clearly they were there long enough for some of these other kind of underlying stories to play out and sort themselves out.
Well, I mean, also Chewie had to be able to assemble C-3PO again during some of that time that they're there. That can't have been easy. There are a lot of wires and everything to connect it. That had to take some time. I know Chewie's very skilled mechanically, but it had to take a little bit of time to put him even part of the way back together.
Yeah, it's a pretty complicated game of C-3PO pickup sticks. The whole backstory of IG-88 pretty shallow by comparison to what was there in Legends, but still fairly interesting. In terms of a little bit more about IG-88 himself, which is important because I think this is going to tie in very, very tightly to the IG-11 character that we're going to see in The Mandalorian. But the actual IG-88 assassin droid series was certainly obsessed with hunting, destroying, and killing as a result of their programming. And in IG-88's case, it was even worse because he had what was considered to be incompletely formed droid programming. So he probably lacked some of the restrictions that the other droids in that series had. He was an independent hunter and was considered by many to be pretty merciless.
Are you saying he had a screw loose?
I think he had several screws loose and maybe a couple of methods missing in his programming.
Yeah, and I think you're right, and this why this ties into the Mandalorian and IG-11 is because if you've seen any of the leaked footage that was taken to Star Wars Celebration Chicago, you get to see a glimpse of IG-11 doing some pretty phenomenal things fighting, and that's the one thing with IG-88 as well. He was able to basically see through all sides of his head. He could look all around him, see everywhere. He was able to pivot his body quickly to fire at different locations if need be. He really was deadly, and there's no better word to put for it because he could really get to you. Now, he had several screws loose, so I think you could take advantage of that with him, as we just heard Rob talking about with Kira. But yeah, he doesn't mean he wasn't lethal and a very good bounty hunter.
Yeah, and in addition to all of that, in the description of IG-88, it's talked about the fact that he has multiple photoreceptors located around his head, so he could see in more than one direction at a given time. He had heat sensors, he had sound sensors, he had a vocoder, which is essentially what allowed him to talk at the base of his head. And to Tom's point, one of the distinctions they make about IG-88 is that his torso was able to fully rotate in battle. So he was able to attack enemies on all sides. And that is exactly what we see within that clip from The Mandalorian. He's basically walking down the street and his upper torso is just rotating and he's got blaster bolts going off in every direction. So I think that's going to be a really cool character to see within The Mandalorian, to see an an IG series assassin droid in action. The tough metal body that he possessed was highly resistant to any damage, although of course it doesn't sound like it was so much an issue for Boba Fett. And he even had acid proof servo wires, so it was a situation where he could not be easily disabled. You really had to know what you were doing to take out an IG series assassin droid.
Yeah, you basically and I just talked about it, and you talked about it earlier. Kira basically had to outsmart him, and I think that's the best way to really approach IG-88. Maybe in the future IG-11, we'll have to see if there's been anything adapted or if it's a little bit different in that regard. But that seems like the best way to defeat them is they're built so much to be lethal, to be these walking weapons, that maybe they lost a little in their cognitive approach.
Yeah, and again, he was a walking arsenal in terms of the types of weapons he used. He would use blaster rifles, pulse weapons, neural inhibitors. He had a needle dart gun, which launched poison darts, and he also within his droid body carried concussion discs, a flamethrower, sonic devices, gas dispensers. I mean, he was a walking arsenal and capable of pretty much dealing out damage in any number of ways.
I mean, what didn't he carry with him? I mean, he had everything to attack every possible way you could. It was really interesting to see. I am very much looking forward to seeing IG-11, and I hope we hear more and we get more in canon about IG-88 as well.
Yeah, and interestingly enough, in terms of kind of the creation of IG-88, there's a neat little kind of piece of trivia with him in that the head that we described with the photoreceptors and everything was actually a repurposed drink dispenser from the cantina in Mos Eisley from the original Star Wars film. So if you're watching the original Star Wars film, or A New Hope as they now call it, pay attention in that scene and you will see behind the bartender these drink dispensers that are an exact copy of IG-88's head within Empire Strikes Back.
Yep. That's the truth. I've seen it there. I've spotted it. I'm like, wow, that looks like 88's head. What's going on back there? Interesting stuff.
So even with the success of the original Star Wars film, Lucas was always looking for ways for them to kind of make use of things that may already be in their arsenal in terms of the set equipment or whatnot. So it's just kind of a fun little twist that they put on him within The Empire Strikes Back.
Right. Completely agree with you.
Sweet. So, moving on from IG-88, obviously we've talked a little bit about how he had kind of some tie-ins with Boba Fett, and Boba Fett is a character that we know a little bit more about. He's addressed in much more detail within the films. Interestingly enough, he was actually supposed to be the primary villain of the sequel to Star Wars, later titled Empire Strikes Back. But it just happened to work out that they ended up going with Vader in that role instead.
Yeah, originally, when Lucas was forming his thoughts on expanding the series to several films, he was going farther into more trilogies, and one, the Emperor wasn't supposed to show up until, I believe I read there was episode 9 originally, and so
Right.
there was going to be a lot more development of some of these side villains as well. But when they decided to cut that short, not do that originally, they ended up instead, having him be more of a side character, and Vader taking the larger role.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of fans, certainly people who've been pretty vocal about the fact that they would have loved to see more Boba Fett within the original trilogy for sure. Fortunately, we get some of Boba Fett's backstory within the prequels. We get to see Jango Fett in action, who is a great character, and within the Clone Wars, and not so much in Rebels, but really within the Clone Wars, you do get to see a lot more of kind of the adolescent Boba Fett, and even kind of into his teenage years a little bit. So we'll go ahead and just jump right into that now. Within the prequels, certainly, we see that Jango Fett, who was the template for those clone troopers that made up the Grand Army of the Republic, was compensated for that service in a number of ways. First, he was certainly given a very sizable financial compensation for it, but he did have one other request, and that was Boba Fett. So I've got a clip of that here.
They are totally obedient, taking any order without question. We modified their genetic structure to make them less independent than the original host.
And who was the original host?
A bounty hunter called Jango Fett.
And where is this bounty hunter now?
Oh, we keep him here. Apart from his pay, which is considerable, Fett demanded only one thing: an unaltered clone for himself. Curious, isn't it?
Unaltered?
Pure genetic replication, no tampering with the structure to make it more docile, and no growth acceleration.
I should very much like to meet this Jango Fett.
I would be very happy to arrange it for you.
So clearly, Jango Fett was concerned about kind of carrying on his legacy, and Boba Fett was essentially as clean a replication of Jango Fett as you could have. And it was pretty clear that he was being groomed by Jango Fett to kind of carry on in his image within that film.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, he was Django's son. Even though all the clones had a piece of Django or much of Django in them, the DNA anyway, this was truly kind of his idea of, I'm probably never going to be able to settle down and have children or whatever, but I can do this. So this is going to be my son, and I'm going to train him, following his father's footsteps, essentially.
Yeah, and you really get to see within Attack of the Clones when Jango Fett and Boba Fett are making their escape from Kamino after it's been pretty clear to Jango Fett that Obi-Wan is onto him and knows that he is tied to that assassination attempt on Padme back in Coruscant, that Jango stays to fight Obi-Wan and directs Boba to, get the ship ready so they can make their escape. And Boba is very efficient, even at that young age, at, getting the Slave One prepped, actually helping the fight in terms of taking some shots at Obi-Wan with the ship's cannons as well, and is the one that flies that ship away when they escape from Obi-Wan, who throws that tracker at it as they're departing.
Yeah, he was obviously been trained already by his father. If you've read into it at all, he's also been trained in firing a blaster as well. He was getting the skills he needed. He was really, like I said, Django was getting him set in every way to be his son, to follow in his footsteps. Maybe eventually they thought they could team up and do much more glorious things.
Right. And of course, Boba Fett was also present at the end of Attack of the Clones when Django faced off with Mace Windu in the arena there on Geonosis. and he was a witness to Mace Windu essentially decapitating his father. We kind of leave that film with him sitting there, kind of crouching on the arena floor, holding his father's Mandalorian helmet kind of to his head, and really at that point he's taking a vow that he is going to avenge his father in any way that he can, and he wants to kill Mace Windu as a result.
Right, something he never ever got over, as far as we knew. Definitely, when as Mace Windu was alive, we don't know. Well, we don't even actually know really truly that Mace Windu is dead. But as far as we know, when Mace Windu passed, maybe that was when he kind of got past that part. But definitely, when during his young life, he was not getting over that for sure.
No, and within this is kind of where it crosses over more into the Clone Wars, which is appropriate considering the fact that that's really what the Attack of the Clones film feeds right into. Within the Clone Wars, we do get to see some of his attempts to avenge his father by killing Mace Windu, and one of the very early clips that we get to see of that is on one of the Republic cruisers. Of course, they've got these young clone troopers that are being brought onto these ships as trainees or cadets, and kind of being indoctrinated into what is going to be expected of them as they get older. And of course, young Boba Fett, who is a direct genetic clone of Jango Fett, slides in with one of these groups and essentially uses that as cover to make an attempt on Mace Windu's life, as we show in this clip.
Boba, is that you?
It is.
I'm sending you the data now.
Receive transmission. Boba out.
Hey, what are you doing here?
Communicate, sir. Eyes only. I've been dispatched to General Windu's quarters. There's no problem, sir.
Oh, there's a problem. You're lying. Admit it. You're lost. Come on, cut the kid a break. Windu's quarters are that way, Shiny.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Eyes on where you're headed, Cadet.
Yes, sir. Sorry, sir.
Sir, General Skywalker requests your presence on the bridge.
I'll be there shortly.
The General requests your presence immediately, sir.
No rest for the weary. Put these inside my quarters, would you?
Yes, sir.
So basically, within that scene, Mace Windu escapes by the skin of his teeth in that scenario, but it is the first indication that he's got someone out there who is looking to kill him for whatever reason, and he's not really sure what that is at that point in time.
Yeah, not at that moment. He can't quite figure it out. But yeah, it was interesting to see a little bit of what led up to that scene. Boba mixing in with the other young clones there, and kind of really feeling at home there. Although you could tell that he had had a little more training to that point. He was a little more skilled. They even nicknamed him Lucky, which was interesting. But it was a fascinating thing. I find it interesting that, you talk about how there's much more in canon about Boba Fett, but if you've only seen the films, you don't really know that much about Boba Fett. I mean, that you've seen in the original trilogy that, he is the one who helped hunt down Han Solo. He was there on Tatooine in Return of the Jedi, helping fight on Jabba's side, but doesn't really last very long in that film. And then you see him very young as Jango's essential son, but then you really don't get that much about him. But again, we sell it over and over again. You need to look at some of these animated series in the Clone Wars. You get a lot more on Boba Fett in that, and this, as we're talking about right now, is leading into that.
Yeah, and I think probably the other good point to make about Boba Fett and Jango Fett by association is I think there's generally, even amongst fans that are a little bit more familiar with the expanded portions of canon that you get to see in the animated series, but everything always points to the fact that that both Boba and Jango wear Mandalorian armor, and I think it's assumed by many that he is in fact Mandalorian, when the reality is that neither of them are. The Mandalorian armor was something that Jango Fett wore really for the advantages that it gave him as a bounty hunter. It had lots of weapons and lots of defensive measures within that armor that would help him fighting Jedi as well as his other quarry, and it was, again, just assumed that he was a Mandalorian. So that is likely to be kind of the difference between what we see with Boba Fett and Jango Fett and what we see within the Mandalorian, the series that's coming out on Disney Plus, is that I think within the Mandalorian, we are expecting that is going to actually truly be a Mandalorian who is not only wearing the armor, but really kind of carrying on those Mandalorian traditions that we also see within both the Clone Wars and Star Wars Rebels.
Yeah, I mean the one thing about is when we're during the original trilogy, something that you may not know out there is that the Mandalorians were really being kept in check by the Empire, very much so, because the Emperor kind of feared them a little bit, because if they got together and fought back, they could be very vicious. They could be deadly to him. So they wanted to make sure and keep that as separated and as in check as possible. So really, you don't hear much from the Mandalorians during the actual original trilogy, but that doesn't mean that once their reigns are freed, they're not going to be seen make a comeback. At least some of them, and that's why, hopefully during the Mandalorian, that the Mandalorian is actually a Mandalorian.
Let's see how many times we can say Mandalorian in a sentence. I think it's a competition, and we're neck and neck at this point.
There we go.
Yeah. I think it is an excellent point. I mean, when we talked about the history of the Jedi in one of our earlier episodes, one of the key events within the Jedi Order was the war with the Mandalorians. And the Mandalorians, as Tom indicated, they were very skilled and very adept at fighting Force users. In fact, a lot of the countermeasures that they had built into their armor were specifically for dealing with Force users. So, we see that within Return of the Jedi as Luke is battling Boba Fett. He's got that basically grapple launcher, that cord that shoots out of his gauntlet and wraps around Luke, and he's able to actually escape from that using his lightsaber. Speaking of Luke Skywalker and Boba Fett, within the Darth Vader comic series, there is actually a mission that Darth Vader sends Boba Fett on, which is to capture Luke and bring him to Darth Vader. This is after the events of A New Hope, where the Death Star is blown up, and certainly Vader is interested in who this young individual who's strong in the Force is that is able to blow up the Death Star, and he kind of wants to see if that individual is going to join him in overthrowing the Emperor, and Boba Fett is the character that is tasked with that job of bringing Luke in.
Yeah, it was actually a very interesting. And again, I just did some reading on this. I haven't read the comics yet, and all the more reason why I want to delve into these comics very, very soon, because fascinating stuff. This is really directly after the Battle of Yavin, and he goes. Essentially, the Emperor sends Darth Vader to Tatooine to kind of talk with Jabba about getting some extra resources, doing some more stuff to build the military even larger than it needs. I don't know why the Emperor needed to contact Jabba, but that was the way. And on the side, Darth Vader kind of goes instead and meets also with Boba Fett and says, look, this is also what I need. I need to find out who this boy was that is the person that ended up destroying the Death Star. And wow, some interesting things ensue from that.
Yeah, again, it's just another example of how within the expanded offerings that they've got in regards to Star Wars entertainment beyond the films, even beyond the animated TV series, these comic series are certainly instrumental into kind of adding a lot of these details into canon. And interestingly enough, if you are an Amazon Prime member, and you go out and search the Kindle store, you will find that a lot of these comics and even some of the kind of compilation volumes of them can be or not watched, but read for free using your Kindle device. So that is actually how I was able to get caught up on a number of these Darth Vader comics, and certainly a lot of interesting information about a lot of characters that you see in the films that are not addressed within any great detail within them.
Yeah, I've heard people rave about them for so long, and I was like, oh, that's great, and I'm like comics, okay, but I was just never really a comic person per se. But the more that I hear about it, the more I'm doing studying for this show, just and everything else. Because I've watched the series, I've seen the movies, I read a couple of the books, but I haven't delved deeply into them. The more I read about it, I'm like, wow, I really, really need to get into these because there's some interesting stuff going on in these comics and in these books.
Right. And actually getting back into a little bit of the Clone Wars information that we were talking about earlier. So, Boba Fett makes this attempt on Mace Windu's life aboard one of these Republic cruisers and they end up abandoning ship. A number of these young clones that are essentially cadets or trainees are ordered to evacuate the ship as a result. And Boba and his pod actually get picked up by a group of bounty hunters that include Aura Singh, who, again, is that bounty hunter that you see perched atop kind of a rocky outcropping during the pod race. She's very pale and kind of has a long top knot of hair. And one of the other bounty hunters that are part of this group that pick up Boba were Bosk, who's that Trandoshan bounty hunter, and another bounty hunter named Castus, I believe is his name.
I think that's right.
Yeah. So Boba joins up with them. They vow to, kind of take him under their wing and help him get his revenge against Mace Windu. And a little bit later in the series, there is another attempt on Mace Windu's life where Boba rigs his father's helmet with an explosive charge on a crashed ship. And Mace Windu and Anakin Skywalker are kind of lured to that location. And that plays out like this.
Clone cadets. Jango Fett. Boba.
Anakin, no! Drop it!
Whose helmet is that anyway?
It belongs to a bounty hunter I killed on Geonosis by the name of Jango Fett.
You mean the clone template?
Yes. Strangely enough, he had a son. Or at least a clone he regarded as a son. His name is Boba Fett.
I remember now. Obi-Wan listed him in his report on Kamino.
Boba was on Geonosis when his father died. He watched as I killed him.
That would complicate things.
So as a result of that attempt on Mace Windu's life, he is able to kind of deduce that it is in fact Boba Fett that is looking to get his revenge for the death of his father, and really is what launches the attempts by the Jedi to kind of track Boba Fett down and bring him to justice. There's another kind of cool side story that takes place with Ahsoka, who we've talked about at length on this show, as well as Plo Koon, who is the Jedi Master that brought Ahsoka into the Jedi Order and is a cool character in his own right. I think it would be a lot of fun to have an entire episode dedicated just to Plo Koon.
Agreed on that. I know very little about him, but every time he's on the screen, I've always found him extremely interesting.
Yeah, and actually that'd be a character that I would love them to do more, whether it's within the comics or whether it's within a book about him. I think he would be an incredibly interesting character and someone who a lot of Star Wars fans would be interested in. It's interesting to note in terms of Plo Koon that he actually used a form of Force lightning called Electric Judgment, which was very similar to the Sith Force lightning, and it was fairly controversial amongst the Jedi. So that's kind of something that we really don't see a lot or hear about a lot within Star Wars, that was one of those Force abilities that was not specifically tied to the Sith. But again, it was fairly controversial within the Jedi Order whether any Jedi should be using an ability like that.
Well, I'm sure it is because the Jedi Order was dare anything ever go leaning towards what they considered possibly the dark side. We can't have any of that. And so I can see why that would be a little bit controversial within the council and the Jedi Order itself.
Yeah, I suppose as long as you're just using it to like jumpstart spaceships, then you're okay.
Yeah, you heat up your coffee.
Right, exactly. It would come in handy, certainly if you got a power outage, I suppose. And then kind of within the arc of the Clone Wars, there does come a time where they finally do track down Boba Fett and bring him to justice. And at that point, he kind of realizes that he has taken this vendetta against Mace Windu to an extreme. And while he may never forgive Mace Windu, he kind of admits that he's been wrong about how he's approached it. And that clip goes like this.
I see now I've done terrible things. But you started when you murdered my father. I'll never forgive you.
Well, you're going to have to. Take him away.
So as you can see there, I mean, Boba Fett realizes that killing Mace Windu is not necessarily the means by which he is going to resolve his issues with the death of his father. Interestingly enough, this is kind of the very first we see of the fact that Boba Fett, kind of in his life as a bounty hunter, did have a code that he lived by. He was the type of bounty hunter who, if he took a contract, he was very much committed to finishing that contract and was really fanatical about doing so. So he definitely honored the jobs that he was given, but he also wasn't going to take things too far. He wasn't going to be doing things for revenge per se. It was really just all about the job with Boba.
Right. I mean, he was a bounty hunter. He was out for himself most of the time, but there was some interesting things involved, especially when he was young. I think he got a little more ruthless as he got a little older, but when he was young, there were some times where he kind of swayed a little bit. There was a point where he had the choice of going back to staying with we talked about the young clones he was with and being with them, and he was a little hesitant on leaving and going with this group of bounty hunters and not staying with them. And you got to understand that a little bit. I mean, he lost essentially what was his only family, which was his his clone father, Jango Fett, and then he's there with this group that are kind of rooting him on, about his same age, and essentially are kind of his half brothers or whatever you want to call them. It had to be kind of tough on him and intriguing for him to possibly stay with them at some points. And there were several times where he was put these group of bounty hunters that he was with when he was young wanted to kill several of the clones, to get to their goal. And he balked at it. He didn't want to do that. And again, they were basically his brothers. He didn't want to react in that way. It came up many times in his early life.
Yeah. And once Boba had served his prison sentence for his attempts on Mace Windu, he actually immediately went off and started a bounty hunting syndicate called the Crates Claw, where they use Tatooine as their base of operations, which is why you so often see him associated with Jabba the Hutt. Obviously, that would be a typical client of his working on Tatooine. And that syndicate that he started also included Bosk and Dengar, who is, again, that human bounty hunter you see on the bridge of the Executor within Empire Strikes Back with the wraps around his head, as well as a couple of other bounty hunters. And the other kind of interesting crossover during this period of Boba Fett's life is that he ended up having Asajj Ventress, who was Count Dooku, or Darth Tyrannus, if you prefer, was his Sith apprentice, unbeknownst to the Emperor. And after she had made an attempt on Count Dooku's life and he basically run her off, she took up work as a bounty hunter, kind of looking for her place in the universe, and ended up in this particular scenario crossing paths with Boba Fett and going to work for him.
Hey, boss, who's your girlfriend?
Shut up, Dengar. Hey, boss.
Boss, this
is your boss.
You got a problem with that? My name's Boba, and this is Heisinger. I see you've already met Bosk and Lance. What's your name?
I don't have a name.
So it's gonna be like that, huh?
Look, kid, I don't take orders very well, especially from someone of your stature and obvious lack of experience.
She killed Oked, so she agreed to fill in for him on this particular job. Or, like I said, we can always find another way to settle your debt.
That won't be necessary. I'm a little short of work right now anyway.
She's a little rough around the edges, but we need 6 hunters. Without her, we got no job.
Fine. Let's get going.
Don't we settle first?
What? You don't trust us? When the job's done, you'll get your cut, just like the rest of us.
So that clip is really Asajj being brought in by this group of bounty hunters. She had killed one of them in a bar, and basically as a result, opening had come up for a job that Boba's group was going to do, and they kind of bring her in to fill in that position on their team. So from there, it kind of goes on to some of their adventures, and we won't get into those in detail. It's quite a bit of additional information. But really, from that point, it really does go into, you don't see it so much in the Clone Wars, but that is really the start of Boba Fett kind of taking on the mantle of the bounty hunter that his father was, becoming the person who was considered really the deadliest bounty hunter in the galaxy. And you can see those early ties to Jabba and some of the other characters that we see within the Star Wars original trilogy films.
Interesting thing about him, as I was doing my reading again, and discovered that you knew he was tied with Jabba in many ways, but part of it was that Jabba actually kind of felt like Boba was maybe his only friend. Like he would sit back and have long talks with him at night and share a drink with him in the evenings, sometimes in Jabba's palace. Just kind of a fascinating insight that I would never have imagined until you do some of these readings on some of the things that are out there in some of these comics and in some of these books. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and again, I mean, Boba Fett was a character who was going to live a pretty solitary life. I mean, he kind of worked alone, and I'm sure that also that relationship he had with Jabba kind of went both ways, in the sense that they both provided each other some company, and certainly easy to understand how that could have been the case. We certainly see a lot of Boba Fett within Jabba's palace, especially within Return of the Jedi. And interestingly enough, while within current canon, Boba Fett's story does end at that point where Han Solo accidentally triggers his jetpack. He slams into the side of Jabba's sail barge and falls into the Sarlacc pit, or the Great Pit of Carkoon, depending on what you want to call it. But within the Legend storylines, he actually did escape from the Sarlacc pit and went on to have further adventures. So I guess the question is, we've talked a lot about the fact that they've brought a lot of stuff out of Legends and kind of reintroduced it into canon. And the question is, as we mentioned earlier with Mace Windu, I mean, you see these characters quote unquote die on screen, but it's becoming a little bit like the Marvel Cinematic Universe in the sense that no one's ever necessarily dead. And Boba Fett's certainly a character that I think fans would be willing to see more of if they got the chance.
Yeah, it wouldn't shock me at all if we see him appear in some way, whether it be the films, whether it be popping up in The Mandalorian, which would kind of make a little bit of sense if suddenly there'd be an episode and the Mandalorian runs into Boba Fett somewhere. It'd be kind of fascinating, actually, but it wouldn't shock me if it, even if it's not on the screen, if it's develops into one of these books we're going through as we get farther into what is now canon. It wouldn't shock me. I think that, it's funny because if you saw some quotes from George Lucas, he was surprised that Boba Fett ever became as big a fan favorite as he did. And he is a fan favorite. It's actually amazing, and he's like, I would have done more with him if I had known that people would have loved him so much. I just thought he was just kind of an interesting bounty hunter that can, do some things, but I didn't know that a major part of the fan base was going to love this character.
Yeah, I'm certainly when you look at some of the interviews that they've done with Jon Favreau from The Mandalorian, there is a certain feeling that is evoked when you see that kind of medieval knight armor that they wear, and with all the gadgets they've got loaded into their armor, they're very interesting characters. Certainly, watching Star Wars Rebels and the Clone Wars and getting to see a lot more of that Mandalorian culture and kind of the Death Watch, which is the militant faction of the Mandalorian population, who typically were the ones wearing that armor. It's something that evokes a lot of interest in Star Wars fans in general, and it's certainly understandable why. They've been addressed enough for people to be familiar with them, but there's still a lot of mystery to them, and I think that attracts people.
I agree, and I also think that if you look at the character, if you look at Jango Fett, if you look at Boba Fett, if you look at many of the Mandalorians, and you just see them solely on the screen, because a lot of times, from what we've seen, at least in the films, is that they've been a lone hunter. There's a lot of Batman involved in that, and there's a lot of people who really love Batman, and basically, whoever's wearing the Mandalorian armor is basically the Batman of the Star Wars universe. So it kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, no, I hadn't really thought about it that way, but it is exactly the same kind of thing, right? It's that suit of armor with all the gadgets, and they just always seem to have exactly the thing to deal with whatever that scenario is that they've been thrown into. So I can certainly see the crossover between the Mandalorians and like a Batman type character.
Yeah, I mean, it just totally makes sense to me why people would kind of be drawn to that character. As many people grown up loving Batman, and even in more modern films, how many people have enjoyed the newer Batman. It just totally makes sense that, like, hey, this guy is, he's not. He's not like a Jedi who have all these things ingrained within him. They're using the Force or whatever. He's basically a regular person who's maybe trained a little more, but he's using all these gadgets to his ability, just like Batman.
Yeah, now we're gonna have to start getting that hashtag Star Wars Batman. We're gonna make that popular on Twitter, right?
Yes. Mandalorian hashtag Star Wars Batman.
Exactly. So again, with the Mandalorian coming, I am going to do another episode in this series where we cover some of these other bounty hunters that we've kind of mentioned briefly. Bosk and Dengar are probably the two that have a little bit more of a backstory, as they were mentioned within the Clone Wars, but also Forlom and Zuckuss, who, again, all of these characters had a lot more information out there on them within the expanded universe prior to that moving to Legends. So we may talk a little bit about that in the episode where we address those characters. But I really do think that within the Mandalorian, it would make a lot of sense for some of these characters to kind of make another appearance. And I think it's going to be useful to a lot of Star Wars fans out there who are going to be watching the Mandalorian to know a little bit about them, so that they can, kind of have that extra level of enjoyment when they do see that episode.
Mm-hmm. Agreed. And I think we've seen already that, Disney's form of Lucasfilm is willing to move in some of the legends into canon. And if you're talking about all these bounty hunters that you just discussed, they are already canon. It's just they are already within the films. It's just a matter of expanding on their stories, and whether they reach into the expanded universe and legends, or whether they decide to tell a new tale. It wouldn't shock me if we start to see them making appearances again, even if it's not on films, but in the novels or in the comics.
Yeah, and so if you are, if you're into the bounty hunters, or if you're listening to this episode and you have a favorite bounty hunter, whether it's one of the ones that we're mentioning, or if it's someone else that is part of Star Wars canon that you really enjoy, definitely reach out to us on Twitter. Use the tag JTA Podcast Bounty Hunter, and I will keep an eye on those, and we'll maybe mention a few of those when we do our follow-up episode. Might be kind of fun to hear who people kind of have attached to within that bounty hunter community within the Star Wars films. And so that really will wrap it up for this discussion. As I said, we'll still approach those other four bounty hunters from the film within an upcoming episode. Again, I think we're going to have to pull in a little bit of Legends information to kind of flesh out that episode, in hopes that they do pull some of this stuff back into canon. And to Tom's point about that, one of the issues that they had with the expanded universe, despite all the amazing stories that they had crafted over the years between the end of the original trilogy films and kind of when Lucasfilm was purchased by Disney, is that while the stories were incredible and there was a lot of cool things brought into canon at that time, there was a lot of contradiction. There were a lot of kind of crossed wires that did muddle it a little bit. And I think this is kind of nice that we're able to kind of clean up some of that information and present this as a little bit more of a unified story, which is clearly what the Lucasfilm Story group is focusing on right now.
Yeah, I think when it first began, when the expanded universe first started, it was a little more succinct. There was a little more plausibility to it, but as it more and more novels got out there, more and more writers got out there, there was, like you said, Rob, contradiction. There were some problems, some mixed wires here and there. They had to contain it a little bit at some point, and that's what they did. But that doesn't mean that they're going to completely go away from what you've seen in the expanded universe, what you've seen in Legends or read in Legends or whatever the case may be. And we've seen them bringing them back, some of these characters back in, some of the storylines back in, maybe in a little bit of a different way. But it's good to know that if there are some of your favorite characters that were within the expanded universe, that they may possibly show up at some point in the next several years.
Yep, and I certainly hope that's the case. I mean, they've already done it with the Thrawn character that we've talked about quite a bit on prior episodes, and he was an incredible character that really was from that expanded universe, and the fact that they were able to bring him back in a very interesting way. And I'm actually just finishing up the Thrawn treason story that just came out at the end of July there, and they've done a great job with that 3-story arc as well. So looking forward to more of that. In terms of the HoloNet news for this week, again, it's been fairly light. I do know that for Star Wars Celebration 2020, and I know that Tom, you're looking forward to that already. It does look like they're going to be partnering, as they did in the 2019 celebration, with a vendor that will allow for kind of ticket exchanges to go through a more formal route. And I will be putting some of that information out on our social media. If you're interested in looking at Star Wars Celebration tickets, I know many of those have already been sold out, but there will be opportunities for people who have purchased those tickets and find that they can't go, to have a means to unload those tickets to people who are able to go via this third-party website. And I think that's really the best way to do it. It's going to keep people from being kind of run through the ringer and going through illegal channels to get these tickets that may cause future issues if they do get discovered or banned or whatever the case may be from Celebration.
Or you might get somebody who's selling, not real tickets out there. You don't want to get a fake. You won't want to be all excited to get out to Star Wars Celebration, booked your hotel, booked your trip, whatever the case may be. And you get there to the front door and they're like, sorry, this is a fake, doesn't work. Go through official channels, find those tickets. They will be some people, everybody plans ahead. When you're buying these tickets more than a year in advance, it doesn't mean that everything is going to work out for you. Some of these tickets will show up online, and you may be able to get in if you're there at the right place at the right time. So, if you didn't score them already, that's unfortunate, but keep your hopes high. Something may pop up for you as we get closer to next year, August of 2020.
Yep, and there are still tickets for Thursday and Sunday at Star Wars Celebration available, as well as some of the kids' one-day tickets for those days. So, if you're only able to go for a brief period of time, you may still be able to just go through the regular ticket purchasing option on the Star Wars Celebration website. So check that out. But again, if you're looking for one of the other multi-day passes or whatnot, there should be some opportunities to pick those up as we get closer via this authorized third party. So that pretty much covers it for Star Wars Celebration. But the other thing that I did want to mention, and this is courtesy of Tom, who basically saved my bacon last week, when they announced that the reservations were available for Star Wars Galaxy's Edge at Walt Disney World Resort at the Hollywood Studios Park. The advanced reservations for both Oga's Cantina, Savi's Lightsaber Workshop, and the Droid Depot, it was kind of assumed, I think, by a lot of us that they weren't going to allow you to make reservations more than 30 or 60 days out, and it does look like they have opened that up for a longer period, at least with Oga's Cantina. Primarily, I think, because they consider that a dining reservation. So I have a trip that I've got coming up in late December, and Tom was able to snag some reservations for Oga's for his early December trip, and alerted me to that, and I was actually able to get multiple reservations for both the Lightsaber Workshop, the Droid Depot, and Oga's Cantina for late December, the week between Christmas and New Year's, which is one of the busiest times of year at the Disney parks. So if you are going on a Disney World vacation and interested in getting access to Galaxy's Edge, we would highly recommend that you go ahead and make one of those reservations for your dates, because that is essentially expected to guarantee you access to that land as part of one of their boarding groups.
I'm almost certain that it will guarantee you a way to get into the land. One, because they're charging your credit card if you don't show up, so you have to be able to get in there to actually make your reservation. So the way it works here on California at the Disneyland Resort is that if you make a reservation, say you make a reservation for 1 p.m. for Oga's Cantina, well, then you can get into Star Wars Galaxy's Edge officially at least 1 hour in advance. So you can go there, get in at 12 p.m., get there, check it out, go to your reservation at the cantina, and then you can stay as long as you want after that. So you don't need to worry about a boarding group or whatever else the case may be. You can kind of shape out your day. If you have a 1 p.m. reservation, you can go and check out the rest of it. If it's on the West Coast, Disneyland Park, Disney California Adventure Park, or if you're on the East Coast, you can go check out the studios, you can go get breakfast, go get brunch, sleep in, whatever the case may be, and then you'll kind of know how your day is going to shape out. Whereas if you're going there and you're hoping to get a boarding group, at least from what we expect, they haven't officially announced it yet for Walt Disney World, but as it works at Disneyland Resort, you go in, you get your ticket scanned, your pass scanned, and then you can go on the app or go to a kiosk and sign up for a boarding group. And then you have to wait and kind of see as to when they will let you into Star Wars Galaxy's Edge. Well, so you're kind of, yes, you can do some other things during that time, but you still don't really know how your day is going to shape out. Take advantage of the chance to go out there and get these reservations ahead of time. You'll know that is set aside. You'll know when you go to the Walt Disney World Resort or the Disneyland Resort, look, this is our day. We are definitely getting to Star Wars Galaxy's Edge that day. And then you can shape the rest of your vacation around that.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I think that certainly on a Walt Disney World vacation, it is really about planning. And if you're not a planner and you're okay going and really not knowing what you're going to have access to, and you're not going to get upset by that, then certainly, do whatever makes you happy, or do your vacation exactly how you prefer to do it. But I think for most people, going there and being able to have access to the rides, the attractions, the shopping that they want access to, this is really going to be one of those areas of Walt Disney World that is kind of unusual, I guess I'll say, in terms of, you're not guaranteed to get in there. There has been third party sites that have said that they have kind of examined the Play Disney app. The My Disney Experience app that Walt Disney World puts out there, and looked at the code, and there is kind of base code in there for this boarding group functionality. So we expect that at some point Walt Disney World is going to announce that boarding groups are going to kind of be the approach they take. But as Tom said, go out and get your reservation for Oga's Cantina, and that will guarantee you that you are going to get into the land and allow you to plan the rest of your vacation around that, which is going to be really a big part of what's going to help you make that an enjoyable experience.
Right. It just makes things easier. Why not take advantage of it if you are planning on going? I understand, like, if it's on a whim and this day you're like, hey, we're going to go and check out Star Wars Galaxy's Edge today and hope to get in. Sure. But if you have the chance, if you're planning a trip, especially to the Walt Disney World Resort, but yes, the Disneyland Resort as well, if you're planning it out, go ahead and just take advantage of it. If you do change your mind, you can cancel these reservations 24 hours in advance, and you won't, your money will be refunded to you. So that's not a problem too. You can change your plans. It's not like you're absolutely locked into it, but just, get a jump on it, have this ready to go, have it in your hip pocket as you go out and try and enjoy your time at these resorts.
Yeah, and that holds true for whether it's an Oga's Cantina reservation or whether that is the Lightsaber Workshop or the Droid Depot. All of those can be canceled up up to 24 hours in advance without any fee or any penalty. So just keep that in mind. And I think they're all pretty cool experiences. I will say this, that I know that up until this past week, you could make reservations at Disneyland Resort for both Oga's Cantina and Savi's Lightsaber Workshop, but the Droid Depot was not something you could reserve ahead of time. And Disneyland did just make that change. So if you are visiting Disneyland Resort and you want to make sure that you have an opportunity to try out that droid building experience in the Droid Depot, you should be able to reserve that in advance. Although I think all of those experiences are only allowing you to book, I don't know, what is it, 14 days in advance at this point, Tom?
At Disneyland Resort, yeah,
Yeah.
it's still only 14 days in advance. I know they have mentioned that eventually they're going to open that up to 60 days in advance, but as of checking, actually I didn't check today, but as of checking yesterday, it's still 14 days.
Yep, and that was my experience as well, checking because we have a trip out there coming up in September. So that's pretty much it for our Star Wars news for this week. And Tom, if you would go ahead and let the listeners know how they can find you and the Hyperion Adventures podcast. Tom and his wife Michelle have a great series that they're doing and have been doing for the last few months called Star Wars Remembered. So if you kind of want to relive some of the details of the Star Wars films, that is a great place to check it out. And Tom will give you the details on how to find them.
Yes, thank you, Rob. Always a pleasure being on the Jedi Temple Archives podcast. Yes, we are continuing our Star Wars Remembered series as we count down to the end of the Skywalker saga. We're doing one film a month. This week, as a matter of fact, we are moving into the original trilogy. We are doing Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope, and Rob joins us on all these episodes as our kind of our Jedi archivist to make sure that we're on the straight and narrow with everything we talk about during these films. And so we'll be doing that this week. We've gone through all the films in Star Wars chronological order to this point, and we will be continuing that on into December. And if you want to find us, you can track us down. Best place is at our own website, HyperionAdventurespodcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. We're on iHeartMedia. And if you want to follow us socially, you can find us on Twitter at Hyperion Podcast, Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest at Hyperion Adventures Podcast. And by the way, we are just a little over a week now till D23 Expo 2019, where there is bound to be a lot of Star Wars news coming out. And we will be out there for all the days, checking things out, and we will be, reporting it on it socially on social media, and we will also be doing some wrap-up episodes for each day, kind of talk about what went on at the expo. So you might want to check those out as well.
Yeah, and it's an awesome series. I'm not just saying that because I'm part of it. It's just fun to kind of go back and relive the aspects of the films, and the order that they're doing them is really kind of chronological within the Star Wars universe. So it's a little different take on things. It's going to take us right up to the Rise of Skywalker. So it's kind of a great way to refresh your memory on everything that's gone before if you're not a person that watches the films regularly. And as Tom mentioned, they do cover a lot of other Disney and Marvel news as well. So if you're into those aspects of the entertainment world, then there's certainly a lot of great content out there for that. And certainly something that I would recommend that everyone give a shot. So Tom, thank you for so much for joining me again this week. Very much appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to hearing a lot of what comes out of that D23 Expo.
Couldn't be more excited for it, Rob. I know there's going to be a big Star Wars influence on it. They had so little at Comic-Con here just a few weeks ago. I know they're just waiting to spring a lot of Star Wars information on us at D23, and we're looking forward to covering it all.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we get to hear something about the Cassian Andor series. I know that they may be holding that until Celebration next year, but I'm hopeful that they at least give some basic information about when they expect that to start showing up on the Disney Plus streaming service. So again, thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a rating and a review. That's very helpful in other people finding this podcast. If you are a listener that has friends or acquaintances that are into Star Wars content and you think they'd like this podcast, please just mention us to a friend, and that also will help us grow. If you want to drop us a line with any thoughts on this episode or any of our previous episodes, and you kind of want to get into the discussion on that, we can be reached at jtapodcast@gmail.com, and also on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and Pinterest at JTA Podcast. Twitter is probably the best location if you want to actually get into a discussion about anything that we're covering. We do have some cool stuff coming up in the next few months. I did line up a discussion with an actor named Dominic Pace, who I linked up with out on Twitter, and he is going to be playing a character within The Mandalorian for a couple of episodes. So we're really looking forward to talking with him once we get into November and his episodes are complete. And he's kind of had the ability to talk a little bit more freely about that. And again, I think we already mentioned that we're going to have some other interviews related to The Mandalorian kind of as we get into the new year as well, to get some kind of backstory and behind the scenes information on how that series has been filmed. So all very exciting stuff. Really cool to see people, good people out there getting to live their Star Wars dream. And I think Tom and I would probably be the first to say that if we had the opportunity to do something like that, we'd be jumping at that without any hesitation.
No question about that, Rob.
Awesome. So again, thank you guys for listening. A little shout out to Andy, who I ran into at Blaze Pizza here in Lansing, where I live. I was dropping off some business cards there, and he snagged one of those, and we kind of got into a discussion. So always love meeting people that love Star Wars and want to listen to the podcast. And he actually gave me a great idea for a future show where we're going to talk a little bit about Luke's green kyber crystal that he put into his lightsaber and where that may have come from. So just some fun ideas for future episodes. If you have any ideas, drop us a line. But other than that, we will be back to talk with you guys on a new topic next week. Thank you, and may the Force be with you.